Thanks all for coming. You guys are very loyal. You will do well on the exam as a result. Today we're going to talk about another group of novels, mainly two, that focus on a different aspect of the issue of environmental disaster. And let me say, obviously, again, it's not a science course, but let me say a word about, briefly, about that, and also the sort of political dynamics that are caused, that are created by concern about this issue. And the issue is genetic engineering. So this is another modern anxiety. It's, in certain sense, similar to climate change in that it involves our concerns about our technological intervention in the natural world and what the consequences of the natural world, to the natural world might be. Again, this is another example of our changing sense of nature that I talked about before. The notion of nature being threatening, where our civilization, Western civilization, started with peasants living on the basis of subsistence agriculture and fearing the power of nature, its ability to destroy them through floods or droughts or other kinds of crop failures, and also the sense that nature was pagan, that nature wasn't Christian, that nature was filled with demons and monsters. And then the shift with St. Francis to a countervailing image that nature was beneficent, that nature was our friend, that we could sort of reach an accommodation with nature, despite the obvious continuation of disasters under certain circumstances. But it was a different view. And by the 18th century, when people were beginning to question the whole validity of religion, very often what they would say is, well, and specifically after the religious wars in Europe between Catholics and Protestants, until the 18th century, you don't get people questioning religion itself. What you get is people wondering what the source of validity of religion is if you have this conflict, this vicious and very often lethal conflict between two different or many different branches of this previously unified religion. And people begin to say, well, we all believe in one God, and you can read God's will, or you can read God's plan for people from nature. You don't need Scripture, because there's obviously a disagreement about the interpretation of Scripture. But look at nature. Nature tells us what God has planned for us. So it's this beneficent sense. And then a third movement in modern times to a notion that nature is dangerous again, dangerous for us. But not so much now because it's out of our control, but because we're controlling it. We're controlling it, and we are doing things to it that are likely to produce catastrophe. And that's obviously a theme with climate change, and it's also become a theme that has been reflected in public concern about genetic engineering. Let me just say one very brief word about genetic engineering. It's central to our two books, but it's also interesting in terms of the political dynamics and people's attitudes toward nature. Okay, this is teosinte. Teosinte is the origin of corn. Now, if you look at that, you will not, it does not look like a particularly beneficial or nutritious crop. And it's not. It had to be developed. How was it developed? Through selective breeding. Corn is a remarkable plant when it's our primary source of, not our primary, the single greatest source of nutrition in the world. That is to say, it produces more food value per acre than any other crop. We feed it to animals, we eat it ourselves, and we use it for the as a source of the notorious high fructose corn syrup that sweetens almost all our drinks. When when Europeans came to the New World and they saw the kind of diet that the Indians were eating, they said that someone said the Indians were walking corn. And recently, as a result of high fructose corn syrup, it's turned out that we are walking corn as well. That because it's fed to animals and because it's used as a sweetener, something like 60 or 70% of our bodies can be traced to nutrition that's coming from corn. Now, the thing about corn is it cannot grow without human intervention in its modern form. That is to say, other crops, even if they're domesticated, can be scattered the seeds can be scattered by various means, wind, animals, so on and so forth, and then they'll grow wild, even if they won't grow in the same way that they grow when they're cultivated. Corn will not. Corn will, the ear will fall to the ground, the kernels are too closely packed, it'll all become tangled up with each other, and it will die. So it was remarkable when the Europeans came to the New World to see this crop that didn't have any obvious natural origin. It was a human product, in effect, a product of selective breeding, and it's only been very recently that people were able to trace it back to its original plant.
That last slide, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but which one of those would be what it looked like when the settlers came?
When the settlers came, it looked like basically modern corn. This was the result of American Indian selective breeding, and as you can see, it was selective breeding, selecting the female version of this plant. Now we have a great many of our foods are modified genetically, either by selective breeding or by new methods of transplanting genes. They look like ordinary plants. This is a genetically modified wheat field. It just looks like wheat. So in other words, this has been a technique of modern agriculture to genetically modify plants either by selective breeding or by specific gene importation, obviously the more recent thing. Now, one of the things that concerns people is what you can do with genetic modification. So it doesn't look very threatening here. It begins to look more sinister here. And there's an image of what it might look like. And people are very worried about what might happen. What is the dangers here? It's the sense that we might be doing something to the environment that we ultimately can't control. People have responded very strongly to this. So in the United States, there are labeling laws and there are significant restrictions on genetic engineering in Europe. The Europeans are much more concerned about it than we are. Now, here's the interesting thing, and it raises a complexity. In the case of global warming, the resistance to acting on the basis of scientists' concern and taking definitive action. You may have noticed the Supreme Court just struck down or delayed implementation of the administration's efforts to control emissions due to coal. This is very serious because not only will it affect the amount of greenhouse gas that the United States is producing, but it threatens to undo the Paris Accord on the basis of the fact that the largest economy in the world can no longer comply with its commitments. And so many other countries in the world are now asking, in the light of this Supreme Court decision, well, if the United States isn't going to comply with its commitments, A, what moral force do they have to ask us to comply? And B, what's the practical point of complying when our, if you think about a smaller country, when our little piddling contribution to reducing greenhouse gas emission is going to be overwhelmed by the continuation of the emissions in the United States. So this is very serious. And the political stance, of course, is that people who are resisting this, people who claim it's a hoax, people who don't want us to respond, are putting themselves in opposition to scientists. By now, the level of consensus in the scientific community has reached the point where we can say that this is a certainty. That is to say, to whatever extent we have knowledge, this is knowledge now, that we are doing serious damage to the climate by the release of greenhouse gas, and we will have a variety of catastrophes if we don't control it. In the case of genetically modified foods, the scientific community is on the other side. There is very little concern among scientists that any of these projected or imagined disasters will actually happen. The point that they make is that once you create a new organism, whether you do it by selective breeding or you do it by specific techniques of gene importation, it's the same thing. It's an organism in the environment, and there doesn't seem to be any likelihood that there will be excessive risks. If there's something the matter with the organism, if it's not an effective organism, it's just going to die because it won't be able to survive in nature. There are scary things, but that's a over-muscled Belgian blue cow. But that's the product of selective breeding, not genetic engineering. Now, those pigs were produced by genetic engineering, so there's something a little scary about that, and it suggests a kind of sinister, almost irreverent engineering or manipulation of nature. So people have imagined that.
Are you sure these aren't photoshopped?
This is photoshopped. This is what people are imagining. The pigs, as far as I know, you actually can produce pigs of that. I know you can produce an iridescent rabbit. So, that's real. And that is real. That I know for a fact is a real thing. It looks photoshopped. This is photoshopped. That's photoshopped, and so is that. There's a fear that this technology can create monsters. That fear was, with his usual prescience, the subject of a science fiction horror book, and it really is it's a terrifying book. I mean, by H.G. Wells, called The Island of Dr Moreau. The Island of Dr Moreau is about a man who finds himself on an island that is essentially ruled by, like Jurassic Park, right? An island that's been taken control of by a man, and he's a vivisectionist, and what he's doing is he's combining human beings and animals and creating new creatures. And of course, the action involves these creatures who are under his control rebelling. They're they're well behaved, or when the visitor arrives, or barely well behaved. You can sort of sense that there's tension there. But as time goes on, their animal instincts come out. They turn savage, and there's a disaster from which the character mainly escapes. It's been made into movies 3 times, so it's something that has intrigued people. The character on the island is a stock figure in science fiction. We haven't talked about this so far, but I want to introduce the notion now in connection with this. So science fiction is as I mentioned before, a literature of ideas, imagination, and plot rather than of character, and tends to rely on stock characters. Having said that, though, it's not as if other literature doesn't. I mean, medieval literature was full of stock characters like the concupiscent priest, and Renaissance and early modern literature had the star-crossed lovers. And, these archetypes are things that literature always draws on, sometimes using them simply as sort of cardboard figures to move the plot along. Sometimes, when you get to Shakespeare, for example, in Romeo and Juliet, his star-crossed lovers are enormously realized individual human beings, but still recognizable. This is the mad scientist, one of the basic tropes of science fiction. We all know the very first, as far as I know, the very first appearance in literature of the mad scientist per se, and that is Dr. Frankenstein in Mary Shelley's very famous book. It was written as part of a contest with her husband, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, and several other people who were sitting around trying to decide what to do. And they decided they'd each write a Gothic novel. She won. She was 18 years old at the time. Frankenstein, we all know that in her original, Frankenstein was the name of the scientist, not the name of the monster. It became associated with the monster when Hollywood got a hold of it. But nonetheless, Dr. Frankenstein as the image of the mad scientist. And what is that image? It's the image of someone who's not evil, who's not intrinsically a bad person, getting control of nature. It's somebody who's so obsessed with the desire, very often for knowledge. And what kind of knowledge? Forbidden knowledge. This is going back to the creation story, right? When God, as I may have mentioned before, God does not deny Adam knowledge. In fact, the very next verse in the Bible, after God forbids Adam to eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge, is telling him, you name the animals. It's your job. Why? Because you need that knowledge, because you need, God could have named the animals, right? But you need that knowledge, or alternatively, you need to have done that conceptual act in order to be a full human being. I want you to be a full human being. You need to engage in a conceptual activity. You're going to name the animals, and I will call the animals what you name them. It says that. The names of the animals will be whatsoever you name them. The knowledge that Adam is forbidden is knowledge of good and evil. That's that's the explicit text. So, what is the mad scientist? Is someone who seeks the naming kind of knowledge, namely the empirical knowledge, but has lost track of the knowledge of good and evil. In some sense, that's the kind of image we have here. He's so obsessed, so intent on the pursuit of knowledge that he has lost track of what should and should not be done. So on the island of Dr. Moreau, he's really torturing both. He's torturing these animals, which have become people. I mean, the place where he does the vivisection is called by them the house of pain, and he uses that as a way of controlling them. So, this is, obviously something that conflicts with our moral sensibilities, and Wells means exactly that. And of course, whenever this happens, the result is unintended consequences. There aren't, as far as I know, very many science fiction novels about mad scientists who come up with like the cell phone and it's a good idea and it doesn't have any disadvantages, right? What they come up with, so, and there are a lot of these books. Greg Bear has a well-known book called Blood Music, where the scientist figures out how to make the individual cells in your body intelligent, and it winds up, of course, that he produces a kind of monstrosity that takes over all of North America. And, this theme is sounded over and over again in science fiction literature, with Dr. Frankenstein being the archetype, and Dr. Moreau being a further development specifically focused on genetic engineering. And of course, we now have this theme in modern science fiction as well. So there's the main character from the X-Men, Wolverine, with his genetic modifications. We've seen genetic modification in a little bit, in a couple of the books that we talked about, specifically Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which we talked about before. The movie Blade Runner that was based on it actually brought this theme much more to the surface with these strange little creatures running around. Those are not in the book. There are mechanical animals in the book, and that's exactly what the main character is so anxious to avoid. He wants a real sheep, not an electric sheep. But there's certainly a kind of, but the theme of genetic modification comes up in the androids, the things that the main character is trying to kill. Again, it's not exactly explained how they're made, but this theme is sounded. Of course, this goes back to the notion of robots. So robots are mechanical, but they have at least some organic features. We know from the Terminator series that the creatures in the machines in the future were able to send something, a machine back to the past by having it covered, right, with organic material. So in the process, it also develops an Austrian accent, of course. But, you know, send that back to the past. So, you know, that notion of a mechanical being with an organic skin is another version of this. This brings us to the two books that I wanted to discuss with you today. Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood and The Wind-Up Girl by Paolo Bacigalupi. And I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about both of them. Now, both of these books, although they use genetic engineering to motivate the action, are set against a background of climate change. And we might ask, why is that? What is the connection between these? It seems to be this theme of the threat to nature, the human intervention in nature, which simultaneously has produced these two effects. They're not necessarily connected. You can have climate change without global warming, and you can have global warming without climate change, but the two of them are connected. Oh, I wanted to say, just let me back up for 1 second. So just think about, because it's really an issue. We may come back to it when we have a chance to talk, but think about the complexity here is that the people who are concerned about climate change are essentially drawing from science, and it's science that's supporting them. The people concerned about genetic engineering are in the opposite stance. They're sort of denying the scientific consensus because the scientists are telling us this is not a problem. Now, that's not a universal view, but it's a fairly common one among scientists. It's certainly the majority view among scientists that this is not going to be a problem. So we have a complex political issue about how we're going to deal with information from scientists. The National Geographic had a cover story about science denial. They talked about people who think that the moon landing was a hoax. They talk about people who don't want to get vaccines. They talk about people who won't accept the theory of evolution. But the two that they mentioned that are most politically relevant to our now are genetic engineering, people who distrust genetically engineered products, and people who are denying the reality of climate change. And as you can see, those are moving politically in opposite directions, so it raises an issue for us. And in a way, these books are explorations of whether or not there is a connection and whether or not we should be more concerned about any intervention in nature. So to start off with Oryx and Crake, this is a book about climate change. It's set against a background of climate change. I'll just read very briefly a couple of the passages. Still, as time went on and the coastal aquifers turned salty and the northern permafrost melted and the vast tundra bubbled with methane and the drought in the mid-continental plains regions went on and the Asian steppes turned to sand dunes and meat became harder and harder to come by, some people had their doubts. Okay? It's a perfectly reasonable basis on which to have your doubts. And one of the people who has doubts is the mother of the main character, and it says that there were things his mother rambled on about sometimes, how everything was being ruined and will never be the same again, like the beach house her family had owned when she was little, the one that got washed away with the rest of the beaches and quite a few of the eastern coastal cities when the sea level rose so quickly, and then there was a huge tidal wave from the Canary Islands volcano. Okay, so that brings up the theme that we talked about last week, which is the connection between global warming and flooding and the destruction of coastal cities. Later on, she mentions, I think with a little bit of glee, the fact that Texas has dried up and blown away, in effect. So that's the background. But when the action opens in Oryx and Crake, the human race has, for all we know, been wiped out, seemingly in its entirety, except for the main character, who we're introduced to at the beginning, and is called Snowman. Snowman is our focus in this book. So this is third-person narration, but unlike 40 Signs of Rain, and like the other book we talked about, Odds Against Tomorrow, it is point-of-view narration. We only know what the main character, Snowman, knows. And in fact, the limits on his knowledge are not only of this situation as it develops, but also of the people he relates to, is central to this book. So Snowman is our main character, and that's that's how we see all the action. We learn right at the beginning that there's no one else around, with an exception that I'll mention in a minute. There's no one else around, and we gradually learn that the reason there's no one else around is that there's been a killer epidemic that has, as far as Snowman knows, wiped out all of humanity. The way the book is structured is as parallel narratives. The one narrative is basically a very, very simple story about Snowman, this one person. He's living in a tree with his only clothing being a sheet that he wraps around him, and food that he either scrounges from previous supplies or obtains in a manner I'll describe in a moment, because he's really short on food. He doesn't have any machinery or any equipment or anything like that. He's basically living as a savage out in the wild. That's how we meet Snowman. And the story of Snowman is very, very simple one. Namely, after a few efforts to survive and getting rained on because he's living in a tree and worrying about where he's going to get food from, he decides he needs supplies, and he's going to go to a place that he knows of that's some distance away, not very far, half a day's walk maybe or something like that. And he's going to get supplies, and that's what he does. He walks to this place. It's called Rejuvenescence, and he goes into a structure called the Paradise Dome, and he gets some supplies, and he returns to his tree. Now, that's all that happens to Snowman, although it's described in a kind of vivid detail. The one other thing that's present are a group of humanoid creatures, which he calls Crakers. These creatures are not only physically human-looking, but they're actually very beautiful and very robust. They're magnificently designed humanoids, and we get a sense quite early that they are in fact designed. They are living out in nature, and Snowman is living right nearby them. He has a very friendly relationship with them. In fact, he's like their mentor or almost a demigod to them. His one supply of protein, other than what he can scrounge, is fish that they bring him on a regular basis. They are totally innocent people. They are naive. They are uneducated. They are pleasant and bland. They live by eating grass and leaves. That is to say, they have no problems, unlike Snowman, they have no problems surviving because they can eat grass. They reproduce in the usual human manner, but their attitude toward that process is completely different. That is to say, they have no sense of sexual guilt. They mate by a kind of a ritualized process that is clearly built into their instincts. That is to say, the female goes into heat, several males gather around her, one of them impregnates her, and they're done, without any tension, without any rivalry, without anything like that. So Crake visits them early on, gets his fish, his weekly allotment of fish from them, and then he goes off to get some additional supplies from this facility that's not at the beginning described. But interpolated with that is a story, that simple story is a series of flashbacks which tell us Snowman's previous life when he was growing up in the society before humanity was wiped out. At that point, he was known as Jimmy, that's his name, and the book tells us basically in chronological order about Jimmy's life. Each time, of course, in flashbacks that are interpolated with this relatively simple story of his trip to the rejuvenescence compound. Okay, so his life is, I mean, the first scene, we know immediately that something's gone wrong. One of his first memories is of a lot of farm animals being burned. Obviously, they've been diseased, and something has gone wrong with what? Probably genetic engineering. We're not exactly told because we only see things through Jimmy's eyes, and Jimmy is something like 4 years old when he sees this bonfire. Therefore, he doesn't know the cause of it. We never learn the cause of it, but we suspect. Jimmy lives in a compound run by a company. The company is called Organ Inc., or Organic, Organ Inc. And what they're doing is they're making genetically engineered animals to make up for what's ever happened to the farm animals. Specifically, they're making a very productive version of a pig. It's sort of, I think you can picture it as the pig version of this, called a pagoon. And that's their main product, although for fun, they also make some other animals, including a rakunk, maybe something like that or that, a rakunk, that Jimmy's father actually gives him one as a pet. One of the only nice present he ever gets from his father. His father's a kind of remote scientist, not exactly a mad scientist, just maybe one with Asperger's, but he's a remote guy, and he usually gives Jimmy stuff Jimmy doesn't care about, but he does give him a rakunk. Jimmy meets, when he's in high school, a new kid who comes in whose name is Glenn, And Glenn is obviously really, really intelligent. The two of them become friends. Their friendship consists of playing computer games together and watching pornography, including child pornography, together. And while they're watching child pornography, they're both struck by one 8-year-old Asian girl who's engaged in sex. She's performing fellatio on a man. And she looks at the camera, and somehow this makes a big impression on both of them. And in fact, they print out a copy of this event because they're so struck by what she looks like. Their favorite game, though, isn't pornography. It's Extinctathon, which is described as a game where you essentially figure out ways to make animals extinct. The idea is Adam named the living animals, Extinctathon names the extinct ones. That's how. And the company that makes it is called Mad Adam. Okay? So we already have a sort of sense of threat connected with this. But the game itself is described simply as a computer game. So the two of them are friends at this high school in the compound, Health Weiser High School. And after they graduate, Jimmy, who's not much of a scientist and doesn't seem to have, he doesn't have quantitative skills, has to settle for advanced training. There are no more universities. Has to settle for advanced training at the Martha Graham Institute, where they teach you a variety of verbal skills, but it's very low grade. His friend, whose name is Craig, his name is Glenn, but he renames himself Craig, and I'll mention why in a minute. But Craig goes on to a very prestigious institute called Watson Crick, where he learns genetic engineering and becomes a master of it because he is a genius. So the two of them basically go their separate ways. Jimmy graduates with what is described as a dingy degree from Martha Graham. And while Craig is the star of Watson Crick and goes to work for Rejuvenescence, a big company that's working on genetically engineered products and other products. Jimmy has to settle for working for a New You, which is a sort of self-improvement company. They don't have any high technology, and Jimmy goes into goes to work for them using his verbal skills, which are significant, but not very valued these days, doing advertising for a New You. And finally, he's hired by Craig to do product promotion for a new product that Craig has come up with. So Craig has been working now at Rejuvenescence, and he's come up with several products. One of them is Bliss Plus, which is a pill. And this pill has a number of advantages. It gives you enormous libido. It prolongs youth, and it protects you from disease. What Craig does not tell the people to whom the pill is marketed is that it also makes you sterile. And when Jimmy expresses surprise that Craig is doing this, namely selling a pill that does things that is not described, Craig points out that there are too many people in the world, and this is a relatively painless way of reducing the population. It is at this point that the reader gets a sense that this is a mad scientist. That is to say, until this point, Craig has been described sort of along the Asperger's lines as clearly a genius, but not a angry or mean or obsessive guy at all. Just somebody who, doesn't get much pleasure out of human interaction, but is using his mental powers to get ahead, to do what ordinary people do, namely get the best job possible. He's living a very good life when he hires Jimmy, because he's the most valued scientist at this major facility. So things are looking great, but it's when he tells Jimmy what this pill is supposed to do that you get a sense that there's something going on here. The other character is a character named Oryx. She's the girl who Jimmy and Glenn saw, Glenn Craik saw in the kiddie porn movie, and we then get a further set of flashbacks, flashbacks within flashbacks, describing her life. Namely, the flashbacks, remember, are all about Jimmy and Jimmy's life, but then Jimmy has been talking to to Oryx. Oryx narrates her life, and we get the story of her life within Jimmy's flashbacks. She doesn't even remember what country she came from, although it's almost certainly Thailand. She was sold as a 7 or 8 year old girl to a man who was using her for, not really for sex. He's using her to beg on the streets selling flowers and to make assignations with men. They take her back to their hotel room to have sex, but then the man she's sold to bursts in and essentially shakes them down. Not surprisingly, ultimately he gets killed playing this game. She gets sold to a place which is making porno movies and using her for that purpose. She does learn English in this process. She gets kidnapped and taken overseas, winds up living as a sex slave in a garage, at which point there is a revelation that this has happened in the newspapers. It becomes a big story. And what does she do? She goes to work as essentially a prostitute at Watson Crick, part of what's called student services. Craik makes use of student services because he doesn't really have time for normal relationships, so he figures this is an efficient way. But he becomes intrigued with Oryx, who he actually remembers from the movie. He's not sure it's the same person. He doesn't spend much time talking to her, but he becomes intrigued with her, and he hires her when he moves to Rejuvenescence. Now, Rejuvenescence has a second product in addition to the Bliss Plus pills, and that is genetically engineered human beings. These are the people who are going, and we realize we've now met in Snowman's life after the disaster. Obviously, one of the pieces of genetic engineering that has been built into them is resistance to disease. And as we hear Craik talk more, we become aware what he's doing here with these people. This is his image of the way rational people ought to behave. And that's what he's created. It would be rational if we could eat grass. It would be rational if we didn't get emotionally engaged in sex, but just used it mechanically for purposes of reproduction. It would be rational if we weren't troubled by a deep self-consciousness. It would be rational if we didn't have moral conflicts. And so he's built this all into these creatures that he's designed, and then comes the denouement. Now, before I describe that, a few things about this. First of all, notice the similarities with the space merchants. This is a lineal descendant of that same notion of resource depletion, it's a kind of similar version of the world. First of all, this is a privatized world. There's no government. The world is run by big companies. The companies in Oryx and Crate actually built compounds, fortified encampments, where within the wall life is very good. People are, there's plenty of resources because they're producing products that they sell. And there's relative safety. Anybody who misbehaves will be kicked out. The rest of the world are what's called the plebe lands. And this is a kind of disorganized, chaotic, dangerous place. Life is going on there. It's not a catastrophe, but it's not prosperous. It's not pleasant. Of course, what are the people in the compounds doing? They're making products that they sell to the people in the plebe lands, and we can assume that they're doing all the, that these people are doing the basic factory work and the basic agricultural work that's necessary, and then using the money to buy these various products that are being produced by the people in the compounds, who are essentially like parasites. They're like blisters on the body of society in some sense in these fortified compounds. There has been resource depletion, and everybody has to deal with that. Even the genetic engineering process, you may remember in Space Merchants, there was Chicken Little, this blob of protoplasm. So they're not only pagoons, but there's a kind of a plant that produces knobs of chicken called chicky knob that I think must have been inspired by Chicken Little. Also, the main character is an advertising executive. This is significant, of course, because advertising, and this is the critique, is the process of manipulating human desire, selling things to you you don't really need, but you will want, and then creating habits, making those things habit-forming, so we have to keep using them. So this is really a critique of modern business and modern enterprise, just like the Space Merchants are. It's that, this sort of runaway consumerist culture is going to destroy us, and it's going to destroy us by depleting our resources and doing something else that is mentioned in the Space Merchants, but brought out here, I think, a good deal more. Finally, there are eco-terrorists. There are the Conchis, who turn out to be the good guys in in the Space Merchants, and there are eco-terrorists of various kinds in this novel as well. Jimmy's mother becomes one of them. She leaves the house. She liberates his raconk in the process, to his great dismay. But she leaves the house. She's disgusted with her husband, who is obviously participating in this. And subsequently, Jimmy sees her actually in news footage where she's participating in a demonstration. The result being that he's investigated by the security forces within the compound to make sure that he's not in communication with his mother. So there's that theme as well. One of the things that Atwood brings out, I think more than the Space Merchants, is that this not only is destroying society, but destroying our own sense of self. Everyone you've noticed already in the book has a different name. So they've all been renamed and in a way separated from their identity. So Craig is, Glenn names himself Craig because he's playing this extinctathon, and you're supposed to give yourself the name of an extinct animal. So that's a crake. It's a little bird, and he chooses that name for himself. Jimmy chooses the name Thickney for some extinct animal, and he never uses it except in the game. So it just vanishes from his consciousness. But Glenn calls himself Crake and becomes Crake ever after, and he's called Crake in the novel. We only find the name Glenn is only used, I think, once when Jimmy first meets him. The woman, the girl who's from Thailand, We never learn her real name. She probably doesn't remember it herself. She tells Jimmy she doesn't. And ultimately, when she goes to work for Craik gives her a name, as he's given fake names to all the scientists working for him, all of whom, by the way, were previously the programmers for Mad Adam. And Mad Adam, these programmers are also eco-terrorists, but he's sort of brought them in and given them jobs. So, and that's an Oryx. He names her Oryx, and that's her name. Jimmy, of course, renames himself Snowman, and I'll describe that in a minute. The denouement is that Craik is truly a mad scientist. He has decided that not only are there too many people, but there are the wrong kind of people, and he decides to exterminate them all. And what he does is he builds into Bliss Plus not only a sterilization, but a killer epidemic. And he has Oryx distribute it. He's immune. Presumably she's immune. He's secretly made Jimmy immune. But essentially everybody else is going to be subject to this disease. And who's going to be left? The Craikers, these artificial people he's created who he thinks, and maybe in his own image, not his image of exactly who he is, but who he wants to be, that these people are going to take over the world. And in fact, that seems to be what happens. While Jimmy is working in the place where these people are built, called the Paradise Dome, it's set up as a sort of Garden of Eden where these Craikers can learn how to function. And Oryx, by the way, was hired to train them. Craik releases this epidemic, and as far as Jimmy knows, it kills everybody but him. He's in the dome. Craik returns to the dome with Oryx, having distributed the pills. Something has happened to them. We're not told what. They've had some trouble. They're both bleeding. They come in. Craik looks at Jimmy and slits Oryx's throat in front of him, at which point Jimmy shoots him. So they're both dead and they're lying there. And that's the end of the story, the backstory. And then that comes very near the end of the book, and then the backstory and the current story essentially converge. So this is the mad scientist at the most extreme. Jimmy then leads the Craikers out of Paradise Dome to the seashore where they will have more to eat. So obviously the image here is very much the image of creation, the image of new people. And who are these people? They're people who have not eaten from the tree of knowledge, that is to say, knowledge of good and evil. They're innocents. And that's what Craik wanted. And that's the world where Jimmy, now Snowman, finds himself. Jimmy names himself Snowman because he wants a new name. He's not going to call himself Thickney, that's for sure, right? He has to come up with some name for the Craikers. He doesn't want to call himself Jimmy anymore. And he names himself the Snowman. He's not sure why. And then in this passage, and there's a lot of very good prose in this book, he thinks about why. Maybe he's not the abominable snowman after all. He's by this point obviously disheveled and his long beard, and he sees himself as a kind of wild man or savage just because of the way he looks. His personality is not at all changed, but he sees himself that way. Maybe he's not the abominable snowman. Maybe he's the other kind of snowman. The grinning dope set up as a joke and pushed down as entertainment. His pebble smile and carrot nose an invitation to mockery and abuse. Maybe that's the real him, the last Homo sapiens, a white illusion of a man, here today, gone tomorrow, so easily shoved over, left to melt in the sun, getting thinner and thinner until he liquefies and trickles away altogether. So that's the kind of image of himself that is derived from this name. So in other words, what's happened is she's questioning the whole nature of human identity and whether or not science and technology has undermined our identities to the extent that something like this might happen, and is a renewed innocence, which is what Craik has been striving for, the one way to restore humanity. I thought we might take a moment before going on to sort of, some of you may have read it, or you've now heard a little bit about it. One question I had when I was reading the book the first time, it's clear that there's an impending disaster, and it's clear that that disaster involves a killer epidemic. I had assumed, when I was reading it the first time, that this was going to be another novel of, another science fiction novel of unexpected consequences. That is to say that the epidemic would be an effort to provide something beneficial, like Bliss Plus was supposed to be, that escaped and got away. What Atwood does instead, though, is make it a conscious plan. There are not unexpected consequences for this mad scientist. He does exactly what he planned to do. So my question for you is, what do you think the author is trying to say with that? I mean, this is a variation on the mad scientist theme, isn't it? We don't have unexpected consequences. We have a conscious plan. Now, obviously, you can just dismiss it and say she's created a mega villain, someone who's just all unexplained evil, like the Joker in the Batman movies or the typical villain in a Hollywood movie. But you have to assume, I think, that she's got a more serious goal here, that this is a serious novel. Yes?
Well, even though it is a sci-fi novel, to me there is a fair underlying emphasis on human relationships. And I reread it recently, it's been a while since I read it, and particularly the scene with Craik killing Oryx in front of Jimmy, which seemed very vengeful. And there's that triangle because both of these guys as young teenagers were fascinated with, their hormones had gone wild, but particularly with Oryx. And then Oryx and Jimmy have this illicit affair.
Right.
And I don't know.
They're a love triangle, right? I hadn't mentioned that. Jimmy is having an affair with her too.
It's easy to see a human being as a one-sided, whether he's a mad scientist or an inept person at numbers or whatever, but in fact humans are more complex than that. And I just felt there was this underlying suggestion that all along Craik had some envy of Jimmy's ability to do things that Craik was totally incapable of.
Like love, right. Jimmy has a great sex life, and Craik doesn't seem to be interested in it. Now, Jimmy's explanation for why Craik does that is that it's an assisted suicide. Namely that Craik knows Jimmy is going to shoot him, and that he wants that to happen so that the security forces don't torture him and make him reveal the antidote. In other words, he wants to make sure that he exterminates all humanity. And he's afraid that if he's alive, that the security forces will get a hold of him and get the antidote out of him by torture or mental readjustment, that they have the capacity to do that. So he feels he needs to die. Of course, why does he need to die by killing Oryx is the question. So this contributes to some of the sense of, as you say, of not knowing exactly what the motivations are here. Any other thoughts about,
I can't speak to the novel, novel, but sometimes when, in the case of, say, a supervillain, the reason for not explaining the motivations is that ultimately evil is incomprehensible.
And certainly Jimmy finds it incomprehensible. I mentioned at the beginning that we see things entirely through Jimmy's eyes. Part of the importance of that is that we never understand Crake and Oryx fully. Oryx has this very casual attitude towards sex. He's enraged that she was used as a child sex slave. He's enraged that she was imprisoned in a garage. And she says, look, you know, the man who was, having sex with me when I was 8 years old also taught me English. I wouldn't be able to talk to you now if it weren't for him. So don't be so mad at him. And when Jimmy expresses outrage that she was locked in a garage, she says, well, the garage was pretty comfortable. That's the way I got to the United States. And again, if I hadn't gotten to the United States, we wouldn't know each other. Now, what's happened here? Has sex become so commercialized that it's lost its meaning? And is this an adumbration of Crake's decision about how to deal with sex for these artificial beings? And is Crake right? Have we reached the end? I mean, one of the possibilities here is that Crake is right. No one's going to agree that we should exterminate humanity. But have we reached the end? Have we reached a point of consumerization and resource depletion such that our lives have no meaning and we're destroying our environment? That's the end of history, in effect. And maybe Crake is right, at least in the diagnosis, even if obviously no one's going to accept his solution. But he wants to start new. He wants to start with a new being, a being that's different from current ones. So it's a striking vision. The one note of redemption, of course, is Jimmy himself, who is for all his flaws, not only a kind person, but someone who retains his kindness. When he realizes everyone else is dead, he could just walk away and leave the Quakers to die from lack of food in the Paradise Dome. But he not only takes them out of the Paradise Dome, but he nurtures them and tries to help them in whatever ways he can. They're basically self-sufficient, but he's providing. But his attitude toward them is one of kindness. And
Crake loses morality.
Yes.
Totally.
Yes. He has.
We reject that, don't we?
Well, so I mean, another way to ask the question is: was God moral? I mean, there's the flood, right? So the sequel to this is called The Year of the Flood. So that's what God did, didn't he? He created a flood. He wiped out humanity. He started again. He also, created these beings without knowledge of good and evil, and that seems to have been his vision for how people would live, right? Without a knowledge of good and evil, and therefore, the way he set it up, they'd have as much food as they wanted, right? When did people have to start farming, right? When did they start having technology? When they've eaten the apple. What's the relationship between that? Why is a knowledge of good and evil condemn you to limited resources? So, that's a question that we can ask about the story that we use, as part of our religious background to explain the creation. And she's questioning that as well. Crake has the same vision. Innocence is necessary for a relationship with the world that will not destroy its resources. Maybe, obviously there's a mechanical process. If you eat grass, you don't need agriculture, right? You're not going to develop agriculture if you can eat grass. There's just so much grass and leaves around that why would you bother, right? It's only when you're a hunter-gatherer. So, I think the Crake's plot is obviously startling and disconcerting, but you have to assume that she did it to make us ask questions, and those kinds of questions, as opposed to the set of questions that might be asked if this were one of those unexpected consequences where Craik had been trying to create a Bliss Plus pill that, say, did exactly what he claimed, right? And then inadvertently caused an epidemic that wipes out humanity. Okay, well, these are always a lot shorter than I'd like, but probably you've had enough by now. But let me just briefly talk about The Wind-Up Girl. This is a novel by Paolo Bacigalupi, and it is also a novel about the relationship between climate change and genetic engineering. We are introduced to a world. The novel is set in Bangkok, so we're back in Thailand also. It's a world that has clearly gotten extremely hot, and heat is described all through the book in a very visceral way. The seas have risen, and Bangkok is protected by a giant seawall. And just like when there's a gun that appears in a movie, in the first part of the movie, you know it's going to go off by the end of the movie. You know that this seawall is going to break by the end of the book, and indeed it does, inundating the city of Bangkok. And that's done purposely again. There is genetic engineering of animals. There are megadonts, giant elephants, and there are also these sort of feral cats called Cheshires that lurk around all the time. But that is not what motivates the action, these animals. There's also extensive resource depletion, and that's one of the dominant premises of the book. There are no fossil fuels left, or almost none. The military has a few vehicles that still run on fossil fuel, but for the most part, there aren't. The action begins in a factory where springs are being made. How do you store energy if you don't have fossil fuels? Well, they're making very tightly wound springs, and they're using megadont power, these giant elephants, to wind these machines that produce the springs. And that's how we start. But that's not, the resource depletion is a problem. But the problem that motivates the action is genetic engineering of plants. And the backstory isn't fully explained, but there's been an ecological disaster, and it's very hard to grow plants. There are a lot of diseases going around. We can assume that what's happened is monoculture, namely like the Irish potato famine, that genetically engineered plants have become dominant, and then once a disease gets started, the disease will wipe out the whole crop. So you need to create new crops. The new crops are created by, and here's the same theme again, giant companies. Once again, there is no government, or no government in significant control. And this is a theme from the space merchants to Oryx and Craik, to Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, which I mentioned, to this book. It's a very interesting theme because the older science fiction focused on dominant political control by an evil government, whether it's Zemiatin's We or Brave New World or 1984, right? Here we have the opposite. We have privatization. We have the collapse of government and the uncontrolled operation of private companies. The main character works for a company called Agrogen. Now, his name is Anderson Lake. Now, here's another stock character, and it's an interesting one. I don't know that there's a name. It's the enforcer. It's the tough guy working for a big organization who acts in a relatively amoral way, but begins to have some doubts. This is, remember, Rick Deckard from Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? That's exactly what he's doing. He's working for a big organization, killing these human-like androids. Anderson Lake is come to Bangkok to do a mission for Agrogen. His mission, it appears at first, or he presents himself as the manager of this factory that's winding the springs. The factory is owned by Agrogen, and they're trying to create these springs to store energy. We learn quickly that the factory is in fact a front. What Anderson Lake is there for is to find out where Thailand is keeping their seed bank. They have a collection of seeds that are genetically diverse and can resist these diseases. And the book begins with him finding a fruit grown from one of these seeds in the marketplace, a fruit he's never seen before. And now he knows that, and in fact, there's a kind of a mad scientist named Gibbons who's helping them develop these new products and these new seeds. But he wants access to that seed bank. Now, you don't know, he claims that he wants access to the seed bank for the purpose of producing new products that Agrogen wants. However, we do know that Agrogen has produced, and here's another contact with Orson Cray, sterile seeds. Why sterile? Because that way they can keep selling seeds every year to people. People can't grow new crops from their own seeds because the seeds are sterile. We suspect very early on that what he wants to do is get control of the seed bank and essentially have Agrogen stop the Thailand from being able to produce its own crops, so that they will have to buy from these sterile seeds from Agrogen. Okay, we're almost out of time. I won't go through the whole story with you. This book is like 40 Signs of Rain. It's told in third-person narration, but from multiple characters. So we see what each character sees, but we see different characters, and we're introduced to people in Thailand who are engaged in a political battle. The political battle, and it's very interesting. He takes account of modern bureaucracy in a way that science fiction doesn't often do. The political battle is between the two most powerful bureaucracies in Bangkok. One is the environmental ministry that's responsible for stopping these diseases, and the other is the trade ministry that wants to deal with Agrogen and get rich bringing in Agrogen products, and is complicit in Agrogen's effort to get control of the seed bank, which is now pretty much in the which is when the book begins, pretty much in the hands of the Thai government or of the environmental ministry. The wind-up girl, and this is where I'll end. The wind-up girl is a genetically engineered sex doll or creature created in Japan who's been abandoned in Bangkok by her Japanese owner when he had to leave all of a sudden. In other words, he brought her with her because, you know, that's what you pack when you go on a trip, right? But he left her. She is very distrusted by the Thais. Now, she looks like a normal human being, but she moves in a herky-jerky way. She's a wind-up, just like the products being made by this factory. She's a contrivance. She's something that's been done to deal with the situation. Now, it's sort of interesting, isn't it? The situation is resource depletion, but the situation is also a kind of moral depletion that leads people to want a wind-up girl rather than a normal human relationship. And so she and this factory springs have this kind of a connection to each other. Anderson sort of falls in love with her. And a lot of the action relates to his relationship with this, with Emiko, the wind-up girl. She has real feelings. And in this sense, she's a very familiar stock figure in science fiction literature, right? The robot, one of the earliest science fiction works is the 1927 play R.U.R. Rosmer's The Universal Robots, written by the Czech author Karel Čapek, I mentioned this before, using the word for slave, robot. So she's not exactly a robot, she's a genetically engineered creature. But what's interesting is and we'll come back to this at the end of the class, of the class when we talk about another book. Unlike the earlier robots, like Robbie the Robot from Forbidden Planet, she's a sexual creature. And this is a theme in modern literature, maybe because it's more sexually explicit, but I also think because something is being said about human relationships that wasn't being said before, and about the intervention of machinery and technology in the way we relate to each other. And that's a lot about what this book is about as well.
Perfect time. Thank you very much. Everybody, we will take a minute if you have.